Welcome, this is Morgan Freeman, AI voice. I will read for you The 48 Law of Power, one of the most popular self-help book written by Robert Greene, first published in 1998. First law: never outshine the master judgment. Always make those above you feel comfortably superior. In your desire to please and impress them, do not go too far in displaying your talents, or you might accomplish the opposite of fear and insecurity. Make your masters appear more brilliant than they are, and you will attain the heights of power. Transgression of the law. Nicolas Fouquet, Louis XIV's finance minister in the first years of his reign, was a generous man who loved lavish parties, pretty women, and poetry. He also loved money, for he led an extravagant lifestyle. Fouquet was clever and very much indispensable to the king, so when the Prime Minister Jules Mazarin died in 1661, the finance minister expected to be named the successor. Instead, the king decided to abolish the position. This and other signs made Fouquet suspect that he was falling out of favor, and so he decided to ingratiate himself with the king by staging the most spectacular party the world had ever seen. The party's ostensible purpose would be to commemorate the completion of Fouquet's chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, but its real function was to pay tribute to the king, the guest of honor. The most brilliant nobility of Europe and some of the greatest minds of the time, La Fontaine, La Rochefoucauld, Madame de Sévigné attended the party. Molière wrote a play for the occasion, in which he himself was to perform at the evening's conclusion. The party began with a lavish 7-course dinner, featuring foods from the Orient never before tasted in France, as well as new dishes created especially for the night. The meal was accompanied with music commissioned by Fouquet to honor the king. After dinner, there was a promenade through the chateau's gardens. The grounds and fountains of Vaux-le-Vicomte were to be the inspiration for Versailles. Fouquet personally accompanied the young king through the geometrically aligned arrangements of shrubbery and flower beds. Arriving at the garden's canals, they witnessed a fireworks display which was followed by the performance of Molière's play. The party ran well into the night, and everyone agreed it was the most amazing affair they had ever attended. The next day, Fouquet was arrested by the king's head musketeer, d'Artagnan. 3 months later, he went on trial for stealing from the country's treasury. Actually, most of the stealing he was accused of he had done on the king's behalf, and with the king's permission, Fouquet was found guilty and sent to the most isolated prison in France, high in the Pyrenees Mountains, where he spent the last 20 years upon. Interpretation: Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a proud and arrogant man who wanted to be the center of attention at all times. He could not countenance being outdone in lavishness by anyone, and certainly not his finance minister. To succeed Fouquet, Louis chose Jean-Baptiste Colbert, been famous for his parsimony and for giving the dullest parties in Paris. Colbert made sure that any money liberated from the treasury went straight into Louis's hands. With the money, Louis built a palace even more magnificent than Fouquet's, the glorious Palace of Versailles. He used the same architects, decorators, and garden designer. And at Versailles, Louis hosted parties even more extravagant than the one that cost Fouquet his freedom. Let us examine the situation. The evening of the party, as Fouquet presented spectacle on spectacle to Louis, each more magnificent than the one before, he imagined the affair as demonstrating his loyalty and devotion to the king. Not only did he think the party would put him back in the king's favor, he thought it would show his good taste, his connections, and his popularity, making him indispensable to the king and demonstrating that he would make an excellent prime minister. Instead, however, each new spectacle, each appreciative smile bestowed by the guests on Fouquet, made it seem to Louis that his own friends and subjects were more charmed by the finance minister than by the king himself, and that Fouquet was actually flaunting his wealth and power, rather than flattering Louis XIV. Fouquet's elaborate party offended the king's vanity. Louis would not admit this to anyone, of course. Instead, he found a convenient excuse to rid himself of a man who had inadvertently made him feel insecure. Such is the fate, in some form or other, of all those who unbalance the master's sense of self, poke holes in his vanity, or make him doubt his preeminence. When the evening began, Fouquet was at the top of the world. By the time it had ended, he was at the bottom. Voltaire, 1694 to 1778. Observance of the law. In the early 1600s, the Italian astronomer and mathematician Galileo found himself in a precarious position. He depended on the generosity of great rulers to support his research, and so, like all Renaissance scientists, he would sometimes make gifts of his inventions and discoveries to the leading patrons of the time. Once, for instance, he presented a military compass he had invented to the Duke of Gonzaga. Then he dedicated a book explaining the use of the compass to the Medicis. Both rulers were grateful, and during them Galileo was able to find more students to teach. No matter how great the discovery, however, his patrons usually paid him with gifts, not cash. This made for a life of constant insecurity and dependence. There must be an easier way, he thought. Galileo hit on a new strategy in 1610, when he discovered the moons of Jupiter. Instead of dividing the discovery among his patrons, giving one the telescope he had used, dedicating a book to another, and so on as he had done in the past, he decided to focus exclusively on the Medicis. He chose the Medicis for one reason. Shortly after Cosimo I had established the Medici dynasty, in 1540, he had made Jupiter, the mightiest of the gods, the Medici symbol, a symbol of a power that went beyond politics and banking. One linked to ancient Rome and its divinities. Galileo turned his discovery of Jupiter's moons into a cosmic event, honoring the Medicis' greatness. Shortly after the discovery, he announced that the bright stars, the moons of Jupiter, offered themselves in the heavens to his telescope at the same time as Cosimo I Pius' enthronement. He said that the number of the moons four harmonized with the number of the Medicis. Cosimo I had 3 brothers, and that the moons orbited Jupiter as these 4 suns revolved around Cosimo I. More than coincidence. This showed that the heavens themselves reflected the ascendancy of the Medici family. After he dedicated the discovery to the Medicis, Galileo commissioned an emblem representing Jupiter sitting on a cloud with the 4 stars circling about him, and presented this to Cosimo I as a symbol of his link to the stars. In 1610, Cosimo I made Galileo his official court philosopher and mathematician, with a full salary. For a scientist, this was the coup of a lifetime. The days of begging for patronage were over. Interpretation. In one stroke, Galileo gained more with his new strategy than he had in years of begging. The reason is simple: all masters want to appear more brilliant than other people. They do not care about science or empirical truth or the latest invention. They care about their name and their glory. Galileo gave the Medicis infinitely more glory by linking their name with cosmic forces than he had by making them the patrons of some new scientific gadget or discovery. Scientists are not spared the vagaries of court life and patronage. They too must serve masters who hold the purse strings. And their great intellectual powers can make the master feel insecure, as if he were only there to supply the funds, an ugly, ignoble job. The producer of a great work wants to feel he is more than just the provider of the financing. He wants to appear creative and powerful, and also more important than the work produced in his name. Instead of insecurity, you must give him glory. Galileo did not challenge the intellectual authority of the Medicis with his discovery, or make them feel inferior in any way by literally aligning them with the stars. He made them shine brilliantly among the courts of Italy. He did not outshine the master, he made the master outshine all others. Keys to power. Everyone has insecurities. When you show yourself in the world and display your talents, you naturally stir up all kinds of resentment, envy, and other manifestations of insecurity. This is to be expected. You cannot spend your life worrying about the petty feelings of others. With those above you, however, you must take a different approach when it comes to power. Outshining the master is perhaps the worst mistake of all. Do not fool yourself into thinking that life has changed much since the days of Louis XIV and the Medicis. Superior to those around them in intelligence, wit, and charm. It is a deadly but common misperception to believe that by displaying and vaunting your gifts and talents, you are winning thy master's affection. He may feign appreciation, but at his first opportunity he will replace you with someone less intelligent, less attractive, less threatening, just as Louis XIV replaced the sparkling Fouquet with the bland Colbert. And as with Louis, he will not admit the truth but will find an excuse to rid himself of your presence. This law involves 2 rules that you must realize. First, you can inadvertently outshine a master simply by being yourself. There are masters who are more insecure than others. Monstrously insecure, you may naturally outshine them by your charm and grace. No one had more natural talents than Astor Manfredi, Prince of Faenza. In the year 1500, Caesar Borgia laid siege to Faenza. When the city surrendered, the citizens expected the worst from the cruel Borgia, who, however, decided to spare the town. He simply occupied its fortress, executed none of its citizens, and allowed Prince Manfredi, 18 at the time, to remain with his court in complete freedom. A few weeks later, though, soldiers hauled Astor Manfredi away to a Roman prison. A year after that, his body was fished out of the river Tiber, a stone tied around his neck. Borgia justified the horrible deed with some sort of trumped-up charge of treason and conspiracy, but the real problem was that he was notoriously vain and insecure. The young man was outshining him without even trying. Given Manfredi's natural talents, the prince's mere presence made Borgia seem less attractive and charismatic. The lesson is simple: if you cannot help being charming and superior, you must learn to avoid such monsters of vanity. Either that, or find a way to mute your good qualities when in the company of a Caesar Borgia. Second, never imagine that because the master loves you, you can do anything you want. Entire books could be written about favorites who fell out of favor by taking their status for granted, for daring to outshine. In late 16th century Japan, the favorite of Emperor Hideyoshi was a man called Sen no Rikyu. The premier artist of the tea ceremony, which had become an obsession with the nobility. He was one of Hideyoshi's most trusted advisors, had his own apartment in the palace. Yet in 1591, Hideyoshi had him arrested and sentenced to death. Rikyu took his own life instead, the cause for his sudden change of fortune was discovered later. It seems that Rikyu, former peasant and later court favorite, had had a wooden statue made of himself wearing sandals, a sign of nobility, and posing loftily. He had had this statue placed in the most important temple inside the palace gates, in clear sight of the royalty who often would pass by. To Hideyoshi, this signified that Rikyu had no sense of limits. Presuming that he had the same rights as those of the highest nobility, he had forgotten that his position depended on the emperor, and had come to believe that he had earned it on his own. This was an unforgivable miscalculation of his own importance, and he paid for it with his life. Remember the following: never take your position for granted, and never let any favors you receive go to your head. Knowing the dangers of outshining your master, you can turn TIS law to your advantage. First, you must flatter and puff up your master. Overt flattery can be effective, but has its limits. It is too direct and obvious and looks bad to other courtiers. Discreet flattery is much more powerful. If you are more intelligent than your master, for example, seem the opposite, make him appear more intelligent than you. Act naive. Make it seem that you need his expertise. Commit harmless mistakes that will not hurt you in the long run, but will give you a chance to ask for his help. Masters adore such requests. A master who cannot bestow on you the gifts of his experience may direct rancor and ill will at you instead. If your ideas are more creative than your master's, ascribe them to him in as public a manner as possible. Make it clear that your advice is merely an echo of his advice. If you surpass your master in wit, it is okay to play the role of the court jester, but do not make him appear cold and surly by comparison. Tone down your humor if necessary, and find ways to make him seem the dispenser of amusement and good cheer. If you are naturally more sociable and generous than your master, be careful not to be the cloud that blocks his radiance from odiers. He must appear as the sun around which everyone revolves, radiating power and brilliance, center of attention. If you are derust into the position of entertaining him, a display of your limited means may win you his sympathy. Any attempt to impress him with your grace and generosity can prove fatal. Learn from Fouquet, or pay die price. In all of these cases, it is not a weakness to disguise your strengths if in the end they lead to power. By letting others outshine you, you remain in control, instead of being a victim of TIR insecurity. This will all come in handy the day you decide to rise above your inferior status. If, like Galileo, you can make your master shine even more in the eyes of odiers, then you are a godsend and you will be instantly promoted. Image. The stars in the sky. There can be only one sun at a time. Never obscure the sunlight or rival the sun's brilliance. Rather, fade into the sky and find ways to heighten the master star's intensity. Authority, avoid outshining the master. All superiority is odious, but the superiority of a subject over his prince is not only stupid, it is fatal. This is a lesson that the stars in the sky teach you. They may be related to the sun, and just as brilliant, but they never appear in her company. Baltasar Gracian, 1601 to 1658. Reversal. You cannot worry about upsetting every person you come across, but you must be selectively cruel. If your superior is a falling star, there is nothing to fear from outshining him. Do not be merciful. Our master had no such scruples in his own cold-blooded climb to the top. Gauge his strength. If he is weak, discreetly hasten his downfall. Outdo, outcharm, outsmart him at key moments. If he is very weak and ready to fall, let nature take its course. Do not risk outshining a feeble superior. It might appear cruel or spiteful. But if your master is firm in his position, yet you know yourself to be the more capable, bide your time and be patient. It is the natural course of things that power eventually fades and weakens. Your master will fall someday, and if you play it right, you will outdive and someday outshine him. 48 Laws of Power. Law 2. Never put too much trust in friends. Learn how to use enemies' judgment. Be wary of friends. They will betray you more quickly, for they are easily aroused to envy. They also become spoiled and tyrannical. But hire a former enemy, and he will be more loyal than a friend, because he has more to prove. In fact, you have more to fear from friends than from enemies. If you have no enemies, find a way to make them. Transgression of the law. In the mid-9th century AD, a young man named Michael I assumed the throne of the Byzantine Empire. His mother, the Empress Theodora, had been banished to a nunnery, and her lover, Theoctistus, had been murdered at the head of the conspiracy to depose Theodora and enthrone Michael. Had been Michael's uncle, Bardas, a man of intelligence and ambition. Michael was now a young, inexperienced ruler, surrounded by intriguers, murderers, and profligates. In this time of peril, he needed someone he could trust as his counselor, and his Teots turned to Basilius, his best friend. Basilius had no experience whatsoever in government and politics. In fact, he was the head of the royal stables, but he had proven his love and gratitude time and again. They had met a few years before, when Michael had been visiting the stables just as a wild horse got loose. The groom's strength and courage had impressed Michael, who immediately raised Basilius from the obscurity of being a horse trainer to the position of head of the stables. Basilius was sent to the finest school in Byzantium, and the crude peasant became a cultured and sophisticated courtier. Now Michael was emperor, and in need of someone loyal. Who could he better trust with the post of chamberlain and chief counselor than a Gad? Basilius could be trained for the job, and Michael loved him like a brother. Ignoring the advice of those who recommended the much more qualified Bardas, Michael chose his friend. Basilius learned well and was soon advising the emperor on all matters of state. The only problem seemed to be money. Basilius never had enough. Exposure to the splendor of Byzantine court life made him avaricious for the perks of power. Michael doubled, then tripled his salary, ennobled him, and married him off to his own mistress, Eudoxia Indorina. Keeping such a trusted friend and advisor satisfied was worth any price. But more trouble was to come. Bardas was now head of the army, and Basilius convinced Michael the man was hopelessly ambitious. Under the illusion that he could control his nephew, Bardas had conspired to put him on the throne, and he could conspire again. It is time to get rid of Michael and assume the crown himself. Basilius poured poison into Michael's ear until the emperor agreed to have his uncle murdered. During a great horse race, Basilius closed in on Bardas in the crowd and stabbed him to death. Soon after, Basilius asked that he replace Bardas as head of the army, where he could keep control of the realm and quell rebellion. This was granted. Now Basilius's power and will only grew, and a few years later Michael, in financial straits from his own extravagance, asked him to pay back some of the money he had borrowed over the years. To have a good enemy, choose a friend he knows where to strike. Diane de Poitiers, 1499 to 1566. Mistress of Henry I of France, every time I bestow a vacant office, I make 100 discontented persons and one ingrate. Louis XIV, 1638 to 1715. Thus, for my own part, one have more than once been deceived by the person I loved most and of whose love above everyone else's I have been most confident. So that I believe that it may be right to love and serve one person above all others, according to merit and worth, but never to trust so much in this tempting trap of friendship as to have cause to repent of it later on. Baldassare. Castiglione, 1478 to 1529. A snake chased by hunters asked a farmer to save its life. To hide it from its pursuers, the farmer squatted and let the snake crawl into his belly. But when the danger had passed and the farmer asked the snake to come out, the snake refused. It was warm and safe inside. On his way home, the man saw a heron and went up to him and whispered what had happened. The heron told him to squat and strain to eject the snake. When the snake snuck its head out, the heron caught it, pulled it out, and killed it. The farmer was worried that the snake's poison might still be inside him, and the heron told him that the cure for snake poison was to cook and eat 6 white fowl. "You re a white foe do I," said the farmer. "You'll do for a start." He grabbed the heron, put it in a bag, and carried it home, where he hung it up while he told his wife what had happened. "I'm surprised at you," said the wife. "The bird does you a kindness, rids you of the evil in your belly, saves your life in fact, yet you catch it and talk of killing it." She immediately released the heron, and it flew away. But on its way it gouged out her eyes. Moral: when you see water flowing uphill, it means that someone. That emperor suddenly realized his predicament. The former stable boy had more money, more allies in the army and senate, and in the end more power than the emperor himself. A few weeks later, after a night of heavy drinking, Michael awoke to find himself surrounded by soldiers. Basilius watched as they stabbed the emperor to death. Then, after proclaiming himself emperor, he rode his horse through the streets of Byzantium, brandishing the head of his former benefactor and best friend, a die end of a long pike. Interpretation. Michael I staked his future on the sense of gratitude he thought Basilius must feel for him. Surely Basilius would serve him best. He owed die emperor his wealth, his education, and his position. The bonds between the two men. It was only on the fateful day when the emperor saw that impudent smile on Basilius's face diet he realized his deadly mistake. He had created a monster. He had allowed a man to see power up close, a man who wanted more, who asked for anything and got it, who felt encumbered by the charity he had received and simply did what many people do in such a situation. They forget the favors they have received and imagine they have earned dire success by their own merits. At Michael's moment of realization, he could still have saved his own life, but friendship and love blind every man to their interests. Nobody believes a friend can betray. And Michael went on disbelieving until the day his head ended up on a pike. "Lord, protect me from my friends, I can take care of my enemies." Voltaire, 1694 to 1778. Observance of the law. For several centuries after the fall of the Han Dynasty AD 222, Chinese history followed the same pattern of violent and bloody coups, one after the other. Army men would plot to kill a weak emperor. Dian would replace him on the dragon throne with a strong general. The general would start a new dynasty and crown himself emperor. To ensure his own survival, he would kill off his fellow generals. A few years later, however, Dai pattern would resume. New generals would rise up and assassinate him or his sons in their turn. To be emperor of China was to be alone. Surrounded by a pack of enemies, it was Dai's least powerful, least secure position in the realm. In AD 959, General Cao Ke Wang Yin became Emperor Sung. He knew Dai odds, Dai probability, Dai at witty. In a year or two he would be murdered. How could he break the pattern? Soon after becoming emperor, Sung ordered a banquet to celebrate the new dynasty and invited Dai most powerful commanders in Dai army. After Tai had drunk much wine, he is repaying a kindness. African folk faff. Dismissed the guards and everybody else except the generals, who now feared he would murder them in one fell swoop. Instead, he addressed them: "The whole day is spent in fear, and I am unhappy both at the table and in my bed. For which one of you does not dream of ascending the throne? I do not doubt your allegiance. But if by some chance your subordinates seeking wealth and position were to force die emperors, yellow robe upon you in turn, how could you refuse it? Drunk and fearing for their lives, the generals proclaimed their innocence and their loyalty. But Sung had other ideas. The best way to pass one's days is in peaceful enjoyment of riches and honor. If you are willing to give up your commands, I am ready to provide you with fine estates and beautiful dwellings where you may take your pleasure with singers and girls as your companions." The astonished generals realized that instead of a life of anxiety and struggle, Sung was offering Diem riches and security. The next day, all of me generals tendered their resignations, and Dai retired as nobles to the estates Mat Sung bestowed on them. In one stroke, Sung turned a pack of friendly wolves, who would likely have betrayed him, into a group of docile lambs, far from all power. Over the next few years, Sung continued his campaign to secure his rule. In AD 971, King Lu of the Southern Han finally surrendered to him after years of rebellion. To Lu's astonishment, Sung gave him a rank in Dai imperial court and invited him to the palace to seal mere newfound friendship wheaty wine. As King Lu took the glass that Sung offered him, he hesitated, fearing it contained poison. "Your subjects' crimes certainly merit death," he cried out, "but I beg your majesty to spare your subject's life." "Indeed, I dare not drink this wine." Emperor Sung laughed, took Dai glass from Liu, and swallowed it himself. There was no poison. From then on, Liu became his most trusted and loyal friend. At meantime, China had splintered into many smaller kingdoms. When Chai Shu, the king of one of these, was defeated, Sung's ministers advised the emperor to lock Dai's rebel up. They presented documents proving that he was still conspiring to kill Sung. When Chai Shu came to visit the emperor, however, instead of locking him up, Sung honored him. He also gave him a package, which he told the former king to open when he was halfway home. Chai Shu opened the bundle on his return journey and saw Dai. It contained all the papers documenting his conspiracy. He realized Mat Sung knew of his murderous plans, yet had spared him nonetheless. This generosity won him over, and he too became one of Sung's most loyal vassals. Interpretation. A Chinese proverb compares friends to Dai jaws and teeth of a dangerous animal. If you are not careful, you will find Diem chewing you. Up. Emperor Sung knew Dai jaws he was passing between when he assumed Dai Daron, his friends in Dai army, would chew him up like meat, and if he somehow survived, his friends in the government would have him for supper. There are many who think, therefore, that a wise prince ought, when he has the chance, to foment astutely some enmity, so that by suppressing it he will augment his greatness. Princes, and especially new ones, have found more faith and more usefulness in those men whom at the beginning of their power they regarded with suspicion than in those they had first confided in. Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, governed his state more by those whom he suspected than by others. Niccolò Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527. A Brahmin, a great expert in Veda who has become a great archer as well, offers his services to his good friend, who is now the king. The Brahmin cries out when he sees the king, "Recognize me, your friend." The king answers him with contempt and then explains, "Yes, we were friends before, but our friendship was based on what power we had. I was friends with you, good Brahmin, because it served my purpose. No pauper is friend to the rich, no fool to the wise, no coward to the brave. An old friend who needs him, it is two men of equal wealth and equal birth who contract friendship and marriage, not a rich man and a pauper. An old friend who needs him." The Mahabharata, c. 3rd century BC. Pick up a B from kindness and learn the limitations of kindness. Sufi proverb. Emperor Sung would have no truck with friends. He bribed his fellow generals witty, splendid estates and kept Diem far away. This was a much better way to emasculate them than killing them, which would only have led other generals to seek vengeance. And Sung would have nothing to do with friendly ministers. More often than not, they would end up drinking his famous cup of poisoned wine. Instead of relying on friends, Sung used his enemies one after the other, transforming them into far more reliable subjects. While a friend expects more and more favors and seethes with jealousy, these former enemies expected nothing and got everything. A man suddenly spared the guillotine is a grateful man indeed, and will go to die ends of die earth for the man who has pardoned him. In time, these former enemies became Sung's most trusted friends. And Sung was finally able to break Dai pattern of coups, violence, and civil war. The Sung dynasty ruled China for more than 100 years. In a speech Abraham Lincoln delivered at the height of the Civil War, he referred to the Southerners as fellow human beings who were in error. An elderly lady chastised him for not calling them irreconcilable enemies who must be destroyed. "Why," Madam Lincoln replied, "do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Men are more ready to repay an injury than a benefit, because gratitude is a burden and revenge a pleasure. Tacitus CID 55 to 120. Keys to power. And it is natural to want to employ your friends when you find yourself in times of need. The world is a harsh place, and your friends soften thy harshness. Besides, you know DM. Why depend on a stranger when you have a friend at hand? The problem is that you often do not know your friends as well as you imagine. Friends often agree on tilings in order to avoid an argument. They cover up their unpleasant qualities so as to not offend each other. They laugh extra hard at each odious jokes. Since honesty rarely strengthens friendship, you may never know how a friend truly feels. Friends will say that they love your poetry, adore your music, envy your taste in clothes. Maybe they mean it. Often they do not. When you decide to hire a friend, you gradually discover the qualities he or she has kept hidden. Strangely enough, it is your act of kindness that unbalances everything. People want to feel they deserve their good fortune. The receipt of a favor can become oppressive. It means you have been chosen because you are a friend, not necessarily because you are deserving. There is almost a touch of condescension in die act of hiring friends. It secretly afflicts DM. The injury will come out slowly, a little more honesty, flashes of resentment and envy here and there, and before you know it, your friendship fades. The more favors and gifts you supply to revive the friendship die, less gratitude you receive. Ingratitude has a long and deep history. It has demonstrated its powers for so many centuries that it is truly amazing that people continue to underestimate them. Better to be wary. If you never expect gratitude from a friend, you will be pleasantly surprised when they do prove grateful. The problem with using or hiring friends is that it will inevitably limit your power. The friend is rarely the one who is most able to help you, and in the end, skill and competence are far more important than friendly feelings. Michael, I had a man right under his nose who would have steered him right and kept him alive. That man was Bardas. All working situations require a kind of distance between people. You are trying to work, not make friends. Friendliness, real or false, only obscures that fact. The key to power, then, is the ability to judge who is best able to further your interests in all situations. Keep friends for friendship, but work with the skilled and competent. Your enemies, on the other hand, are an untapped gold mine that you must learn to exploit. When Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister, decided in 1807 that his boss was leading France to ruin, and the time had come to turn against him, he understood the dangers of conspiring against the emperor. He needed a partner. A confederate. What friend could he trust in such a project? He chose Joseph Foch, head of the secret police, his most hated enemy, a man who had even tried to have him assassinated. He knew that their former hatred would create an opportunity for an emotional reconciliation. He knew that Foch would expect nothing from him, and in fact would work to prove that he was worthy of Talleyrand's choice. A person who has something to prove will move mountains for you. Finally, he knew that his relationship with Foch would be based on mutual self-interest and would not be contaminated by personal feeling. The selection proved perfect, although the conspirators did not succeed in toppling Napoleon. The union of such powerful but unlikely partners generated much interest in the cause. Opposition to the emperor slowly began to spread. And from then on, Talleyrand and Foch had a fruitful working relationship. Whenever you can, bury the hatchet with an enemy and make a point of putting him in your service. As Lincoln said, you destroy an enemy when you make a friend of him. In 1971, during the Vietnam War, Henry Kissinger was the target of an unsuccessful kidnapping attempt, a conspiracy involving, among others, the renowned anti-war activist priests, the Berrigan brothers, 4 more Catholic priests, and 4 nuns. In private, Without informing the Secret Service or the Justice Department, Kissinger arranged a Saturday morning meeting with 3 of the alleged kidnappers, explaining to his guests that he would have most American soldiers out of Vietnam by mid-1972. He completely charmed them. They gave him some kidnapped Kissinger buttons, and one of them remained a friend of his for years, visiting him on several occasions. This was not just a one-time ploy. Kissinger made a policy of working with those who disagreed with him. Colleagues commented that he seemed to get along better with his enemies than with his friends. Without enemies around us, we grow lazy. An enemy at our heels sharpens our wits, keeping us focused and alert. It is sometimes better. King Hiro chanced upon a time, speaking with one of his enemies, to be told in a reproachful manner that he had stinking breath. Whereupon the good king, being somewhat dismayed in himself, as soon as he returned home, chided his wife. "How does it happen that you never told me of this problem?" The woman, being a simple, chaste, and harmless dame, said, "Sir, thus it is plain that faults that are evident to the senses, gross and corporal, or otherwise notorious to the world, we know by our enemies sooner than by our friends and familiars." Plutarch, C.A.D. 46-120. Then, to use enemies as enemies rather than transforming them into friends or allies. Mao Tse-tung saw conflict as key in his approach to power. In 1937, the Japanese invaded China, interrupting the civil war between Mao's communists and their enemy, the nationalists. Fearing that the Japanese would wipe them out, some communist leaders advocated leaving the nationalists to fight the Japanese and using the time to recuperate. Mao disagreed. The Japanese could not possibly defeat and occupy a vast country like China for long. Once they left, the communists would have grown rusty if they had been out of combat for several years and would be ill-prepared to reopen their struggle with the nationalists. To fight a formidable foe like the Japanese, in fact, would be the perfect training for the communist ragtag army. Mao's plan was adopted, and it worked. By the time the Japanese finally retreated, the communists had gained the fighting experience that helped them defeat the nationalists. Years later, a Japanese visitor tried to apologize to Mao for his country's invasion of China. Mao interrupted, "Should I not thank you instead?" Witty out a worthy opponent, he explained, a man or group cannot grow stronger. Mao's strategy of constant conflict has several key components. First, be certain that in the long run you will emerge victorious. Never pick a fight with someone you are not sure you can defeat, as Mao knew the Japanese would be defeated in time. Second, if you have no apparent enemies, you must sometimes set up a convenient target, even turning a friend into an enemy. Mao used this tactic time and again in politics. Third, use such enemies to define your cause more clearly to the public, even framing it as a struggle of good against evil. Mao actually encouraged China's disagreements with the Soviet Union and the United States without clear-cut enemies. He believed his people would lose any sense of what Chinese communism meant. A sharply defined enemy is a far stronger argument for your side than all the words you could possibly put together. Never let the presence of enemies upset or distress you. Are far better off with a declared opponent or two than not knowing where your real enemies lie. The man of power welcomes conflict, using enemies to enhance his reputation as a sure-footed fighter who can be relied upon in times of uncertainty. Image the jaws of ingratitude. Authority. Knowing what would happen, know how to use. If you put a finger in enemies for your own, the mouth of a lion. Prophet. You must learn to grab a. You would stay sword not by its blade, which would clear of it, cut you, but by the handle which allows. With friends you to defend yourself. The wise man you will have profits more from his enemies, no such caution, and then a fool from his friends. If you hire them, they will Baltasar Gracian, eat you alive with ingratitude. 1601-1658. Reversal. Although it is generally best not to mix work with friendship, there are times when a friend can be used to greater effect than an enemy. A man of power, for example, often has dirty work that has to be done, but for the sake of appearances, it is generally preferable to have other people do it for him. Friends often do this the best. Also, if your plans go awry for some reason, you can use a friend as a convenient scapegoat. This fall of the favorite was a trick often used by kings and sovereigns. They would let their closest friend at court take the fall for a mistake, since the public would not believe that they would deliberately sacrifice a friend for such a purpose. Of course, after you play that card, you have lost your friend forever. It is best, then, to reserve the scapegoat role for someone who is close to you but not too close. Finally, the problem about working with friends is that it confuses the boundaries and distances that working requires. But if both partners in the arrangement understand the dangers involved, you must never let your guard down in such a venture. However, always be on the lookout for any signs of emotional disturbance such as envy and ingratitude. Nothing is stable in the realm of power, and even the closest of friends can be transformed into the worst of enemies. 48 Laws of Power. Law 3. Conceal your intentions. Judgment. Keep people off balance and in the dark by never revealing the purpose behind your actions. Guide them far enough down the wrong path, envelop them in enough smoke, and by the time they realize your intentions, it will be too late. Part 1. Use decoyed objects of desire and red herrings to throw people off the scent. If at any point in the deception you practice people have the slightest suspicion as to your intentions, all is lost. Use false sincerity, send ambiguous signals, set up misleading objects of desire. Unable to distinguish the genuine from the false, they cannot pick out your real goal. Transgression of the law. Over several weeks, 9 underling clothes. The most infamous courtesan of 17th century France listened patiently as the Marquis de Sévigné explained his struggles in pursuing a beautiful but difficult young countess. Ninon was 62 at me time, and more than experienced in matters of love. The Marquis was a lad of 22, handsome, dashing, but hopelessly inexperienced in romance. At first Ninon was amused to hear the Marquis talk about his mistakes, but finally she had had enough. Unable to bear ineptitude in any realm, least of all in seducing a woman, she decided to take the young man under her wing. First, I had to understand Matmos was war, and that the beautiful countess was a citadel to which he had to lay siege as carefully as any general. Every step had to be planned and executed with utmost attention to detail and nuance. Instructing Marquis to start over, Ninon told him to approach the countess with a bit of distance, an air of nonchalance. This was to throw her off the scent. The countess was no longer to take his interest in her for granted. Perhaps he was only interested in friendship. Ninon planned ahead. Once the countess was confused, it would be time to make her jealous. At the next encounter at a major fete in Paris, Marquis would show up with a beautiful young woman at his side. This beautiful young woman had equally beautiful friends. So wherever Countess would now see Marquis, he would be surrounded by the most stunning young women in Paris. Not only would Countess be seething weedy jealousy, she would come to see Marquis as someone who was desired by otiers. It was hard for Ninon to make the Marquise understand, but she patiently explained that a woman who is interested in a man wants to see women are interested in him too. Not only does Tiad give him instant value, it makes it all the more satisfying to snatch him from their clutches. Once the Countess was jealous but intrigued, it would be time to beguile her. On Ninon's instructions, the Marquis would fail to show up at affairs where Countess expected to see him. Then suddenly he would appear at salons he had never frequented before, but Countess attended often. She would be unable to predict his moves. All of this would push her into the state of emotional confusion that is a prerequisite for successful seduction. These moves were executed and took several weeks. Ninon monitored the Marquis's progress through her network of spies. She heard how the Countess would laugh a little harder at his witticisms, listen more closely to his stories. She heard that the Countess was suddenly asking questions about him. Her friends told her that at social affairs the Countess would often look up at the Marquis, following his steps. It was a matter of weeks now, maybe a month or two. But if all went smoothly, the citadel would fall. A few days later, the Marquis was at the Countess's home. They were alone. Suddenly he was a different man, this time acting on his own impulse. Rather than following Ninon's instructions, he took the Countess's hands and told her he was in love with her. The young woman seemed confused, a reaction he did not expect. She became polite, then excused herself. For the rest of the evening she avoided his eyes, was not there to say good night to him. The next few times he visited, he was told she was not at home. When she finally admitted him again, the two felt awkward and uncomfortable with each other. The spell was broken. Interpretation. Ninon de l'Enclos knew everything about the art of love. The greatest writers, thinkers, and politicians of the time had been her loversmen like La Rochefoucauld, Molière, and Richelieu. Seduction was a game to her, to be practiced with skill. As she got older and her reputation grew, the most important families in France would send their sons to her to be instructed in matters of love. Ninon knew that men and women are very different, but when it comes to seduction they feel the same deep down inside. They often sense when they are being seduced, but they give in because they enjoy the feeling of being led along. It is a pleasure to let go and to allow the other person to detour you into a strange country. Everything in seduction, however, depends on suggestion. You cannot announce your intentions or reveal them directly in words. Instead, you must throw your targets off the scent. To surrender to your guidance, they must be appropriately confused. You have to scramble your signals, appear interested in another man or woman, the decoy, then hint at being interested in the target, then feign indifference, on and on. Such patterns not only confuse, they excite. Imagine this story from the Countess's perspective. After a few of the Marquis's moves, she sensed the Marquis was playing some sort of game, but die game delighted her. She did not know where he was leading her, but so much the better. His moves intrigued her, each of them keeping her waiting for the next one. She even enjoyed her jealousy and confusion, for sometimes any emotion is better than the boredom of security. But she was willing to wait and see, and probably if she had been made to wait long enough, what he was up to would not have mattered. The moment the Marquise uttered that fatal word love, however, all was changed. This was no longer a game witty moves. It was an artless show of passion. His intention was revealed. He was seducing her. This put everything he had done in a new light. All that before had been charming now seemed ugly and conniving. The Countess felt embarrassed and used. A door closed that would never open again. Do not be held to cheat, even though it is impossible to live today without being one. Let your greatest cunning lie in covering up what looks like cunning. Balthasar Washington, 1601 to 1658. Observance of the law. In 1850, the young Otto von Bismarck, then a 35-year-old deputy in the Prussian parliament, was at a turning point in his career. The issues of the day were the unification of the many states, including Prussia, into which Germany was then divided, and a war against Austria. The powerful neighbor to the south, Diet, hoped to keep Die Germans weak and at odds, even threatening to intervene if Die tried to unite. Prince William, next in line to be Prussia's king, was in favor of going to war, and Die Parliament rallied to the cause, prepared to back any mobilization of troops. The only ones to oppose war were the present king, Frederick William IV, and his ministers, who preferred to appease the powerful Austrians. Throughout his career, Bismarck had been a loyal, even passionate supporter of Prussian might and power. He dreamed of German unification, of going to war against Austria and humiliating the country that for so long had kept Germany divided. A former soldier, he saw warfare as a glorious business. This, after all, was the man who years later would say, the great questions of the time will be decided, not by speeches and resolutions, but by iron and blood. Passionate patriot and lover of military glory, Bismarck nevertheless gave a speech in Parliament at the height of the war fever that astonished all who heard it. Woe unto the statesman, he said, who makes war without a reason will still be valid when the war is over. After the war you will all look differently at these questions. Will you men have the courage to turn to the peasant contemplating the ashes of his farm, to the man who has been crippled, to the father who has lost his children? Not only did Bismarck go on to talk of the madness of this war, but, strangest of all, he praised Austria and defended her actions. This went against everything he had stood for. The consequences were immediate. Bismarck was against the war. What could DIs possibly mean? OTA deputies were confused, and several of them changed their votes. Eventually, Die King and his ministers won out, and war was averted. A few weeks after Bismarck's infamous speech, the king, grateful that He had spoken for peace, made him a cabinet minister. A few years later, he became the Prussian premier. In this role, he eventually led his country and a peace-loving king into a war against Austria, crushing the former empire and establishing a mighty German state, with Prussia at its head. Interpretation. At the time of his speech in 1850, Bismarck made several calculations. First, he sensed that the Prussian military, which had not kept pace with other European armies, was unready for war that Austria, in fact, might very well win, a disastrous result for the future. Second, if the war were lost and Bismarck had supported it, his career would be gravely jeopardized. The answer was to throw people off the scent by supporting a cause he detested, saying things he would laugh at if said by an Omer. A whole country was fooled. It was because of Bismarck's speech that the king made him a minister, a position from which he quickly rose to be prime minister, attaining the power to strengthen the Prussian military and accomplish what he had wanted all along. The humiliation of Austria and the unification of Germany under Prussia's leadership. Bismarck was certainly one of the cleverest statesmen who ever lived, a master of strategy and deception. No one suspected what he was up to in this case. Had he announced his real intentions, arguing that it was better to wait now and fight later, he would not have won the argument. Since most Prussians wanted war at that moment and mistakenly believed their army was superior to the Austrians. Had he played up to die king, asking to be made a minister in exchange for supporting peace, he would not have succeeded. Either the king would have distrusted his ambition and doubted his sincerity. By being completely insincere and sending misleading signals, however, he deceived everyone, concealed his purpose, and attained every dying he wanted. Such is the power of hiding your intentions. Keys to power. Most people are open books. They say what they feel, blurt out their opinions at every opportunity, and constantly reveal their plans and intentions. They do TIAs for several reasons. First, it is easy and natural to always want to talk about one's feelings and plans for the future. It takes effort to control your tongue and monitor what you reveal. Second, many believe by being honest and open, they are winning people's hearts and showing their good nature. They are greatly deluded. Honesty is actually a blunt instrument, which bloodies more than it cuts. Your honesty is likely to offend people. It is much more prudent to tailor your words, telling people what they want to hear rather than the coarse and ugly trum of what you feel or dying. More important, by being unabashedly open, you make yourself so predictable and familiar it is almost impossible to respect or fear you. And power will not accrue to a person who cannot inspire such emotions. If you yearn for power, quickly lay honesty aside and train yourself in the art of concealing your intentions. Master the art and you will always have the upper hand. Basic to an ability to conceal one's intentions is a simple truth about human nature. Our first instinct is to always trust appearances. We cannot go around doubting the reality of what we see and hear, constantly imagining that appearances conceal something else would exhaust and terrify us. This fact makes it relatively easy to conceal one's intentions. Simply dangle an object you seem to desire, a goal you seem to aim for, in front of people's eyes, and they will take the appearance for reality. Once their eyes focus on the decoy, they will fail to notice what you are really up to. In seduction, set up conflicting signals such as desire and indifference, and you not only throw them off the scent, you inflame mere desire to possess you. A tactic that is often effective in setting up a red herring is to appear to support an idea or cause that is actually contrary to your own sentiments. Bismarck used this to great effect in his speech in 1850. Most people will believe you have experienced a change of heart, since it is so unusual to play so lightly with something as emotional as one's opinions and values. The same applies for any decoyed object of desire. Seem to want something in which you are actually not at all interested, and your enemies will be thrown off the scent, making all kinds of errors in their calculations. During the War of the Spanish Succession in 1711, the Duke of Marlborough, head of the English army, wanted to destroy a key French fort because it protected a vital thoroughfare into France. Yet he knew that if he destroyed it, the French would realize what he wanted to advance down that road. Instead, then he merely captured the fort and garrisoned it with some of his troops, making it appear as if he wanted it for some purpose of his own. The French attacked the fort and the Duke let them recapture it. Once they had it back, though, they destroyed it, figuring that the Duke had wanted it for some important reason. Now that the fort was gone, the road was unprotected, and Marlborough could easily march into France. Use this tactic in the following manner. Hide your intentions not by closing up at the risk of appearing secretive and making people suspicious, but by talking endlessly about your desires and goals, just not your real ones. You will kill 3 birds with 1 stone. You appear friendly, open, and trusting. You conceal your intentions, and you send your rivals on time-consuming wild goose chases. Another powerful tool in throwing people off the scent is false sincerity. People easily mistake sincerity for honesty. Remember, their first instinct is to trust appearances, and since they value honesty and want to believe in the honesty of those around them, they will rarely doubt you or see through your act. This is how Iago deceived and destroyed Othello, given the depth of his emotions, the apparent sincerity of his concerns about Desdemona's supposed infidelity. How could Othello distrust him? This is also how the great con artist Yellow Kid Whale pulled the wool over Sucker's eyes, seeming to believe so deeply in the decoyed object he was dangling. In front of them, a phony stock, a touted racehorse, he made its reality hard to doubt. It is important, of course, not to go too far in this area. Sincerity is a tricky tool. Appear overpassionate, and you raise suspicions. Be measured and believable, or your ruse will seem the put-on mat it is. To make your false sincerity an effective weapon in concealing your intentions, espouse a belief in honesty and forthrightness as important social values. Do TIs as publicly as possible. Emphasize your position on TI's subject by occasionally divulging some heartfelt thought, though only one that is actually meaningless or irrelevant, of course. Napoleon's minister Talleyrand was a master at taking people into his confidence by revealing some apparent secret. This feigned confidence a decoy would then elicit a real confidence on the other person's part. Remember, the best deceivers do everything they can to cloak their roguish qualities. They cultivate an air of honesty in one area to disguise their dishonesty in others. Honesty is merely another decoy in their arsenal of weapons. Part 2. Use smoke screens to disguise your actions. Deception is always the best strategy, but the best deceptions require a screen of smoke to distract people's attention from your real purpose. The bland exterior, like the unreadable poker face, is often the perfect smoke screen, hiding your intentions behind the comfortable and familiar. If you lead the sucker down a familiar path, he won't catch on when you lead him into a trap. Observance of the law. In 1910, a Mr. Sam Giesel of Chicago sold his warehouse business for close to $1 million. He settled down to semi-retirement and the managing of his many properties, but deep inside he itched for the old days of deal-making. One day, a young man named Joseph Weil visited his office, wanting to buy an apartment he had up for sale. Giesel explained the terms. The price was $8,000, but he only required a down payment of $2,000. Weil said he would sleep on it, but he came back the following day and offered to pay the full $8,000 in cash if Giesel could wait a couple of days, until a deal Weil was working on came through. Even in semi-retirement, a clever businessman like Giesel was curious as to how Weil would be able to come up with so much cash, roughly $150,000 today, so quickly. Weil seemed reluctant to say, and quickly changed the subject, but Giesel was persistent. Finally, after assurances of confidentiality, Weil told Giesel the following story. Weil's uncle was the secretary to a coterie of multimillionaire financiers. These wealthy gentlemen had purchased a hunting lodge in Michigan 10 years ago, at a cheap price. They had not used die lodge for a few years, so they had decided to sell it and had asked Weil's uncle to get whatever he could for it. For good reasons of his own, the uncle had been nursing a grudge against the millionaires for years. This was his chance to get back at them. He would sell die property for $35,000 to a setup man whom it was Weil's job to find. The financiers were too wealthy to worry about this low price. The setup man would then turn around and sell the property again for its real price, around $155,000. The uncle, Weil, and die-tiered man would split the profits from this second sale. It was all legal and for a good cause, the uncle's just retribution. Giesel had heard enough. He wanted to be the setup buyer. Weil was reluctant to involve him, but Giesel would not back down. The idea of a large profit, plus a little adventure, had him champing at the bit. Weil explained Matt Giesel would have to put up the $35,000 in cash to bring die deal off. Giesel, a millionaire, said he could get dye money with a snap of his fingers. Weil finally relented and agreed to arrange a meeting between the uncle, Giesel, and dye financiers in the town of Galesburg, Illinois. On dye train ride to Galesburg, Giesel met the unclean impressive. Jekiel, Kink of Iswafi, I atiete worship otil, one do I. Baal then Jehu assembled all the people, and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu will serve him much more. Now therefore call to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers and all his priests, let none be missing, for I have a great sacrifice to offer to Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live, but Jehu did it with cunning in order to destroy the worshippers of Baal, and Jehu ordered, Sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent throughout all Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. And they entered the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. Then Jehu went into the house of Baal, and he said to the worshippers of Baal, Search and see that there is no servant of the Lord here among you, but only the worshippers of Baal. Then he went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had stationed 80 men outside and said, The man who allows any of those whom I give into your hands to escape shall forfeit his life. So as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and to the officers, Go in and slay them, let not a man escape. So when they put them to the sword, the guard and the officers cast them out, and went into the inner room of the house of Baal, and they brought out the pillar that was in the house of Baal and burned it. And they demolished the pillar of Baal and demolished the house of Baal. Thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. Old Testament, 2 Kings 10:18-28. Man with whom he avidly discussed business, while also brought along a companion, a somewhat paunchy man named George Gross. Weil explained to Giesel that he himself was a boxing trainer, that Gross was one of the promising prize fighters he trained, and that he had asked Gross to come along to make sure the fighter stayed in shape. For a promising fighter, Gross was unimpressive looking. He had gray hair and a beer belly, but Giesel was so excited about the deal that he didn't really think about the man's flabby appearance. Once in Galesburg, Weil and his uncle went to fetch the financiers while Giesel waited in a hotel room with Gross, who promptly put on his boxing trunks. Distracted as he was, Giesel ignored how badly Die Boxer wheezed after a few minutes of exercise, although his style seemed real enough. An hour later, Weil and his uncle reappeared with the financiers, an impressive, intimidating group of men, all wearing fancy suits. The meeting went well, and the financiers agreed to sell the lodge to Giesel, who had already had the $35,000 wired to a local bank. This minor business now settled, the financiers sat back in their chairs and began to banter about high finance, throwing out the name J.P. Morgan as if they knew the man. Finally, one of them noticed Die Boxer in the corner of the room. Weil explained what he was doing. The financier countered that he too had a boxer in his entourage whom he named. Weil laughed brazenly and exclaimed that his man could easily knock out their man. Conversation escalated into argument. In the heat of passion, Weil challenged the men to a bet. The financiers eagerly agreed and left to get their man ready for a fight the next day. As soon as Ui had left, the uncle yelled at Weil. Right in front of Giesel, they did not have enough money to bet with, and once the financiers discovered this, the uncle would be fired. Weil apologized for getting him in this mess, but he had a plan. He knew the odier boxer well, and with a little bribe they could fix the fight. But where would the money come from? For the bet, the uncle replied. Without it, they were as good as dead. Finally, Giesel had heard enough. Unwilling to jeopardize his deal with any ill will, he offered his own $35,000 cash for part of the bet. Even if he lost that, he would wire for more money and still make a profit on the sale of the lodge. The uncle and nephew thanked him. With their own $15,000 and Giesel's $35,000, they would manage to have enough for the bet. That evening, as Giesel watched the two boxers rehearse die fix in the hotel room, his mind reeled at the killing he was going to make from both the boxing match and the sale of the lodge. The fight took place in a gym the next day. Weil handled the cash, which was placed for security in a locked box. Everything was proceeding as planned in the hotel room. The financiers were looking glum at how badly their fighter was doing, and Giesel was dreaming about the easy money he was about to make. Then, suddenly a wild swing by the financier's fighter hit Gross hard in the face, knocking him down. When he hit the canvas, blood spurted from his mouth. He coughed, then lay still. One of Die Financier's, a former doctor, checked his pulse. He was dead. The millionaires panicked. Everyone had to get out before the police arrived. They could all be charged with murder. Terrified, Giselle hightailed it out of the gym and back to Chicago, leaving behind his $35,000, which he was only too glad to forget, for it seemed a small price to pay to avoid being implicated in a crime. He never wanted to see Weil or any of the others again. After Giselle scurried out, Gross stood up under his own steam. The blood that had spurted from his mouth came from a ball filled with chicken blood and hot water diet he had hidden in his cheek. The whole affair had been masterminded by Weil, better known as the Yellow Kid, one of Die's most creative con artists in history. Weil split the $35,000 with the financiers and the boxers, all fellow con artists, a nice little profit for a few days' work. Interpretation. The Yellow Kid had staked out Giselle as the perfect sucker long before he set up the con. He knew the boxing match scam would be the perfect ruse to separate Giselle from his money quickly and definitively. But he also knew Diet, if he had begun by trying to interest Giselle in the boxing match, he would have failed miserably. He had to conceal his intentions and switch attention. Create a smokescreen, in this case Die sale of the lodge. On Die train ride and in the hotel room, Giselle's mind had been completely occupied with the pending deal. The easy money, the chance to hobnob with wealthy men. He had failed to notice that Gross was out of shape and middle-aged at best. Such is Die distracting power of a smokescreen. Engrossed in the business deal, Giselle's attention was easily diverted to the boxing match, but only at a point when it was already too late for him to notice the details that would have given Gross away. The match, after all, now depended on a bribe rather than on Die Boxer's physical condition. And Giselle was so distracted at Die and by Die illusion of Boxer's deathmat, he completely forgot about his money. Learn from the Yellow Kid, the familiar, inconspicuous front is the perfect smokescreen. Approach your mark with an idea. Diet seems ordinary enough, a business deal, financial intrigue. The sucker's mind is distracted, his suspicions allayed. That is when you gently guide him onto the second path. Die slippery slope down which he slides helplessly into your trap. Sneak across the ocean in road daylight. This means to create a front that eventually becomes imbued with an atmosphere or impression of familiarity, within which the strategist may maneuver unseen while all eyes are trained to see obvious familiarities. The 36 strategies quoted in the Iapanese Art of War. Thomas Cleary, 1991. Observance of the law. In the mid-1920s, the powerful warlords of Ethiopia were coming to the realization Diet, a young man of Dai nobility named Haile Selassie, also known as Rastafari, was out competing them all, and nearing the point where he could proclaim himself their leader, unifying the country for the first time in decades. Most of his rivals could not understand how T.I.'s wispy, quiet, mild-mannered man had been able to take control. Yet in 1927, Selassie was able to summon the warlords, one at a time, to come to Addis Ababa to declare their loyalty and recognize him as leader. Some hurried, some hesitated, but only one, the Jasmite Balcha of Sadamo, dared defy Selassie totally. A blustery man, Balcha was a great warrior, and he considered the new leader weak and unworthy. He pointedly stayed away from Dai capital. Finally, Selassie, in his gentle but stern way, commanded Balcha to come. The warlord decided to obey, but in doing so he would turn the tables on Dia's pretender to die Ethiopian Diron. He would come to Addis Ababa at his own speed and lead an army of 10,000 men, a force large enough to defend himself, perhaps even start a civil war. Stationing T.I.'s formidable force in a valley 3 miles from the capital, he waited as a king would. Selassie would have to come to him. Selassie did indeed send emissaries, asking Balcha to attend an afternoon banquet in his honor. But Balcha, no fool, knew history, knew that previous kings and lords of Ethiopia had used banquets as a trap. Once he was there and full of drink, Selassie would have him arrested or murdered. To signal his understanding of Dai's situation, he agreed to come to the banquet, but only if he could bring his personal bodyguard, 600 of his best soldiers, all armed and ready to defend him and themselves. To Balcha's surprise, Selassie answered with the utmost politeness that he would be honored to play host to such warriors. On the way to the banquet, Balcha warned his soldiers not to get drunk and to be on their guard. When they arrived at the palace, Selassie was his charming best. He deferred to Balcha, treated him as if he desperately needed his approval and cooperation. But Balcha refused to be charmed, and he warned Selassie that if he did not return to his camp by nightfall, his army had orders to attack Dai capital. Selassie reacted as if hurt by his mistrust. Over the meal, when it came time for the traditional singing of songs in honor of Ethiopia's leaders, he made a point of allowing only songs honoring the warlord of Sidamo. It seemed to Balcha that Selassie was scared, intimidated by this great warrior who could not be outwitted. Sensing the change, Balcha believed that he would be the one to call Dai shots in the days to come. At the end of the afternoon, Balcha and his soldiers began their march back to camp amidst cheers and gun salutes. Looking back to the capital over his shoulder, he planned his strategy how his own soldiers would march through the capital in triumph within weeks, and Selassie would be put in his place being either prison or death. When Balcha came in sight of his camp, however, he saw that something was terribly wrong. Where before there had been colorful tents stretching as far as Dai eye could see, now there was noting only smoke from doused fires. What devil's magic was this? A witness told Balcha what had happened. During the banquet, a large army, commanded by an ally of Selassie's, had stolen up on Balcha's encampment by a side road he had not seen. This army had not come to fight, however, knowing that Balcha would have heard a noisy battle and hurried back with his 600-man bodyguard. Selassie had armed his own troops with baskets of gold and cash. They had surrounded Balcha's army and proceeded to purchase every last one of their weapons. Within a few hours, Balcha's entire force had been disarmed and scattered in all directions. Realizing his danger, Balcha decided to march south with his 600 soldiers to regroup. But the same army that had disarmed his soldiers blocked his way. The other way out was to march on the capital, but Selassie had set a large army to defend it. Like a chess player, he had predicted Balcha's moves and had checkmated him. For the first time in his life, Balcha surrendered. To repent his sins of pride and ambition, he agreed to enter a monastery. Interpretation. Throughout Selassie's long reign, no one could quite figure him out. Ethiopians liked their leaders fierce, but Selassie, who wore the front of a gentle, peace-loving man, lasted longer than any of them. Never angry or impatient, he lured his victims with sweet smiles, lulling them with charm and obsequiousness before he attacked. In the case of Balcha, Selassie played on the man's wariness, his suspicion that the banquet was a trap, which in fact it was, but not the one he expected. Selassie's way of allaying Balcha's fierce, letting him bring his bodyguard to the banquet, giving him top billing there, making him feel in control, created a thick smoke screen, concealing the real action 3 miles away. Remember, the paranoid and wary are often the easiest to deceive. Win their trust in one area and you have a smoke screen that blinds their view in another, letting you creep up and level them with a devastating blow. A helpful or apparently honest gesture, or one that implies the other person's superiority, these are perfect diversionary devices. Properly set up, the smoke screen is a weapon of great power. It enabled the gentle Selassie to totally destroy his enemy without firing a single bullet. Do not underestimate the power of Tafari. He creeps like a mouse, but he has jaws like a lion. Balclia of Sidamo's last words before entering the monastery. Keys to power. If you believe that deceivers are colorful folk who mislead with elaborate lies and tall tales, you are greatly mistaken. The best deceivers utilize a bland and inconspicuous front that calls no attention to themselves. They know that extravagant words and gestures immediately raise suspicion. Instead, they envelop their mark in the familiar, the banal, the harmless. In Yellow Kid Wile's dealings with Sam Giesel, the familiar was a business deal. In the Ethiopian case, it was Selassie's misleading obsequiousness, exactly what Balcha would have expected from a weaker warlord. Once you have lulled your sucker's attention with the familiar, they will not notice the deception being perpetrated behind their backs. This derives from a simple truth: people can only focus on one thing at a time. It is really too difficult for them to imagine that the bland and harmless person they are dealing with is simultaneously setting up something else. The grayer and more uniform the smoke in your smoke screen, the better it conceals your intentions. In the decoy and red herring devices discussed in Part 1, you actively distract people in the smoke screen. You lull your victims, drawing them into your web. Because it is so hypnotic, this is often the best way of concealing your intentions. The simplest form of smokescreen is facial expression. Behind a bland, unreadable exterior, all sorts of mayhem can be planned, without detection. This is a weapon that the most powerful men in history have learned to perfect. It was said that no one could read Franklin D. Roosevelt's face. Baron James Rothschild made a lifelong practice of disguising his real thoughts behind bland smiles and nondescript looks. Talleyrand. Never was a face less of a barometer. Henry Kissinger would bore his opponents around the negotiating table to tears with his monotonous voice, his blank look, his endless recitations of details. Then, as their eyes glazed over, he would suddenly hit them with a list of bold terms. Caught off guard, they would be easily intimidated. As one poker manual explains it, while playing his hand, the good player is seldom an actor. Instead, he practices a bland behavior that minimizes readable patterns, frustrates and confuses opponents, permits greater concentration. An adaptable concept. The smokescreen can be practiced on a number of levels, all playing on the psychological principles of distraction and misdirection. People want to believe apparently noble gestures are genuine, for the belief is pleasant. They rarely notice how deceptive these gestures can be. The art dealer Joseph Duvain was once confronted with a terrible problem. The millionaires who had paid so dearly for Duvain's paintings were running out of wall space, and with inheritance taxes getting ever higher, it seemed unlikely that they would keep buying. The solution was the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which Duvain helped create in 1937 by getting Andrew Mellon to donate his collection to it. The National Gallery was the perfect front for Duvain. In one gesture, his clients avoided taxes, cleared wall space for new purchases, and reduced the number of paintings on the market, maintaining the upward pressure on their prices. Another effective smokescreen is the pattern, the establishment of a series of actions that seduce die victim into believing you will continue and die same way. The pattern plays on the psychology of anticipation. Our behavior conforms to patterns, or so we like to think. In 1878, the American robber Baron J. Gould created a company Diet began to threaten dime monopoly of Die Telegraph Company Western Union. The directors of Western Union decided to buy Gould's company up. They had to spend a hefty sum, but they figured they had managed to rid themselves of an irritating competitor. He started up a second company to compete with Western Union and its new acquisition. The same thing happened again. Western Union bought him out to shut him up. Soon the pattern began for the third time, but now Gould went for UI jugular. He suddenly staged a bloody takeover struggle and managed to gain complete control of Western Union. He had established a pattern that had tricked the company's directors into thinking his goal was to be bought out at a handsome rate. Once they paid him off, they relaxed and failed to notice that he was actually playing for higher stakes. The pattern is powerful in that it deceives the other person into expecting the opposite of what you are really doing. Another psychological weakness on which to construct a smoke screen is the tendency to mistake appearances for reality, the feeling that if someone seems to belong to your group, their belonging must be real. This habit makes the seamless blend a very effective front. The trick is simple. You simply blend in with those around you. The better you blend, the less suspicious you become. During the Cold War of the 1950s and 60s, as is now notorious, a slew of British civil servants passed secrets to the Soviets. They went undetected for years because they were apparently decent chaps, had gone to all the right schools, and fit the old boy network perfectly. Blending in is the perfect smoke screen for spying. The better you do it, the better you can conceal your intentions. Remember, it takes patience and humility to dull your brilliant colors, to put on the mask of the inconspicuous. Do not despair at having to wear such a bland mask. It is often your unreadability that draws people to you and makes you appear a person of power. Image as sheep's skin. A sheep never marauds, a sheep never deceives, a sheep is magnificently dumb and docile. With a sheepskin on his back, a fox can pass right into the chicken coop. Authority. Have you ever heard of a skillful general who intends to surprise a citadel, announcing his plan to his enemy? Conceal your purpose and hide your progress. Do not disclose the extent of your designs until they cannot be opposed. Win the victory. before you declare the war. In a word, imitate those warlike people whose designs are not known except by the ravaged country through which they have passed. 9 on Delanclos 1623 to 1706. Reversal. No smokescreen, red herring, false sincerity, or any other diversionary device will succeed in concealing your intentions if you already have an established reputation for deception. And as you get older and achieve success, it often becomes increasingly difficult to disguise your cunning. Everyone knows you practice deception, persist in playing naive, and you run the risk of seeming die-rankest hypocrite, which will severely limit your room to maneuver. In such cases, it is better to own up, to appear the honest rogue, or better, the repentant rogue. Not only will you be admired for your frankness, but, most wonderful and strange of all, you will be able to continue your stratagems. As P.T. Barnum, the 19th century king of humbuggery, grew older, he learned to embrace his reputation as a grand deceiver. At one point he organized a buffalo hunt in New Jersey, complete witty Indians, and a few imported buffalo. He publicized die hunt as genuine, but it came off as so completely fake that die crowd, instead of getting angry and asking for their money back, was greatly amused. They knew Barnum pulled tricks all the time. Diet was the secret of his success, and they loved him for it. Learning a lesson from this affair, Barnum stopped concealing all of his devices, even revealing his deceptions in a tell-all autobiography. As Kierkegaard wrote, "The world wants to be deceived." Finally, although it is wiser to divert attention from your purposes by presenting a bland, familiar exterior, dire are times when colorful, conspicuous gesture is right diversionary tactic. The great charlatan mountebanks of 17th and 18th century Europe used humor and entertainment to deceive their audiences. Dazzled by a great show, the public would not notice the charlatan's real intentions. Thus the star charlatan himself would appear in town in a night black coach drawn by black horses. Clowns, tightrope walkers, and star entertainers would accompany him, pulling people into his demonstrations of elixirs and quack potions. The charlatan made entertainment seem like business of die day. The business of die day was actually sale of the elixirs and quack potions. Spectacle and entertainment clearly are excellent devices to conceal your intentions, but cannot be used indefinitely. The public grows tired and suspicious, and eventually catches on to trick. And indeed, charlatans had to move quickly from town to town before word spread pie potions were useless and entertainment a trick. Powerful people with bland exteriors on the odier handy Talleyrand's roti childs, silices can practice deceptions and same place out their lifetimes. Their act never wears thin and rarely causes suspicion. The colorful smokescreen should be used cautiously then, and only when occasion is right. 48 Laws of Power. Law 4. Always say less than necessary. Judgment. When you are trying to impress people with words, the more you say, the more common you appear, and the less in control. Even if you are saying something banal, it will seem original if you make it vague, open-ended, and sphinx-like. Powerful people impress and intimidate by saying less. The more you say, the more likely you are to say something foolish. Down on his luck. The screenwriter Michael Arlen went to New York in 1944. To drown his sorrows, he paid a visit to the famous restaurant 21 in the lobby. He ran into Sam Goldwyn, who offered the somewhat impractical advice that he should buy racehorses. At the bar, Arlen met Louis B. Meyer, an old acquaintance, who asked him what were his plans for the future. One was just talking to Sam Goldwyn. Began Arlen. How much did he offer you? Interrupted Meyer. Not enough, he replied evasively. Would you take 15,000 for 30 weeks? Asked Meyer. No hesitation this time. Yes, said Arlen. The Little Brown. Book of Anecdotes, Clifton Fadiman. F.D. 1985. One oft-told tale about Kissinger. Involved a report that Winston Lord had worked on for days. After giving it to Kissinger, he got it back with the notation, "Is this the best you can do?" Lord rewrote and polished, and finally resubmitted it. Back it came with the same curt question. After redrafting it one more time and once again, getting the same. Transgression of the law. Gnaeus Marcius, also known as Coriolanus, was a great military hero of ancient Rome. In the first half of the 5th century BC, he won many important battles, saving the city from calamity time and time again. Because he spent most of his time on the battlefield, few Romans knew him personally, making him something of a legendary figure. In 454 BC, Coriolanus decided it was time to exploit his reputation and enter politics. He stood for election to the high rank of consul. Candidates for this position traditionally made a public address early in the race, and when Coriolanus came before the people, he began by displaying the dozens of scars he had accumulated over 17 years of fighting for Rome. Few in the crowd really heard the lengthy speech that followed those scars. Proof of his valor and patriotism moved the people to tears. Coriolanus's election seemed certain. When polling day arrived, however, Coriolanus made an entry into the forum escorted by the entire Senate and by the city's patricians, the aristocracy. Zhuge Liang's situation was hopeless. The enemy would finally capture this renowned leader. Without lamenting his fate, or wasting time trying to figure out how he had been caught, Liang ordered his troops to take down their flags, throw open the city gates, and hide. He himself took a seat on the most visible part of the city's wall, wearing a Taoist robe. He lit some incense, strummed his lute, and began to chant. Minutes later, he could see the vast enemy army approaching, an endless phalanx of soldiers. Pretending not to notice them, he continued to sing and play the lute. Soon the army stood at the town gates. At its head was Sima Yi, who instantly recognized the man on the wall. Even so, as his soldiers itched to enter the unguarded town through its open gates, Sima Yi hesitated, held them back, and studied Liang on the wall. Then he ordered an immediate and speedy retreat. Interpretation. Zhuge Liang was commonly known as the Sleeping Dragon. His exploits in the War of the Three Kingdoms were legendary. Once a man claiming to be a disaffected enemy lieutenant came to his camp, offering help and information. Liang instantly recognized the situation as a setup. This man was a false deserter and should be beheaded. At the last minute, though, as the axe was about to fall, Liang stopped the execution and offered to spare the man's life if he agreed to become a double agent. Grateful and terrified, the man agreed and began supplying false information to the enemy. Liang won battle after battle. On another occasion, Liang stole a military seal and created false documents, dispatching his enemy's troops to distant locations. Once the troops had dispersed, he was able to capture 3 cities, so that he controlled an entire corridor of the enemy's kingdom. He also once tricked the enemy into believing one of its best generals was a traitor, forcing the man to escape and join forces with Liang. The Sleeping Dragon carefully cultivated his reputation of being the cleverest man in China, one who always had a trick up his sleeve. As powerful as any weapon, this reputation struck fear into his enemy. Sima Yi had fought against Zhuge Liang dozens of times and knew him well. When he came on the empty city with Liang praying on the wall, he was stunned. The Taoist robes, the chanting, the incenses had to be a game of intimidation. The man was obviously taunting him, daring him to walk into a trap. The game was so obvious that for one moment it crossed his mind that Liang actually was alone and desperate. But so great was his fear of Liang that he dared not risk finding out. Such is the power of reputation. It can put a vast army on the defensive, even force them into retreat, without a single arrow being fired. For, as Cicero says, even those who argue against fame still want the books they write against it to bear their name in the title and hope to become famous for. Despising it. Everything else is subject to barter we will let our friends have. Our goods and our lives, if need be, but a case of sharing our fame and making someone else the gift of our reputation is hardly to be found. Montaigne, 1533 to 1592. Observance of the law. In 1841, the young P.T. Barnum, trying to establish his reputation as America's premier showman, decided to purchase the American Museum in Manhattan and turn it into a collection of curiosities that would secure his fame. The problem was that he had no money. The museum's asking price was $15,000, but Barnum was able to put together a proposal that appealed to the institution's owners, even though it replaced cash up front with dozens of guarantees and references. The owners came to a verbal agreement with Barnum, but at the last minute the principal partner changed his mind, and the museum and its collection were sold to the directors of Peale's museum. Barnum was infuriated, but the partner explained that business was business. The museum had been sold to Peale's because Peale's had a reputation and Barnum had none. Barnum immediately decided that if he had no reputation to bank on, his only recourse was to ruin the reputation of Peale's. Accordingly, he launched a letter-writing campaign in the newspapers, calling the owners a bunch of broken-down bank directors who had no idea how to run a museum or entertain people. He warned the public against buying Peale's stock, since the business's purchase of another museum would invariably spread its resources thin. The campaign was effective. Die stock plummeted, and we'd no more confidence in Peale's track record and reputation. The owners of Die American Museum reneged on their deal and sold the whole thing to Barnum. It took years for Peale's to recover, and they never forgot what Barnum had done. Mr. Peale himself decided to attack Barnum by building a reputation for highbrow entertainment, promoting his museum's programs as more scientific than those of his vulgar competitor. Mesmerism, hypnotism was one of Peale's scientific attractions, and for a while it drew big crowds and was quite successful. To fight back, Barnum decided to attack Peale's reputation yet again. Barnum organized a rival mesmeric performance in which he himself apparently put a little girl into a trance. Once she seemed to have fallen deeply under, he tried to hypnotize members of the audience, but no matter how hard he tried, none of the spectators fell under his spell. A frustrated Barnum finally announced that to prove the little girl's trance was real, he would cut off one of her fingers. Many a sheep who'd injured me in no respect, and even in my time been known to try shepherd pie. If need be, then I'll die. Yet I suspect that others also ought to own their sins. It's only fair that all should do their best to single out the guiltiest. Sire, you're too good a king, the fox begins. Such scruples are too delicate. My word to each sheep, that profane and vulgar herd. That's sin, nay, sire. Enough for such a crew to be devoured by such as you, while of the shepherds we may say that they deserved the worst they got. Theirs being the lot that over us beasts plot a flimsy dream begotten sway. Thus spake the fox, and toady cheers rose high, while none dared cast too cold an eye on tigers, bears, and other eminencies most unpardonable offenses. Each, of never mind what currish breed, was really a saint. They all agreed. Then came the ass. To say I do recall how once one crossed an abbey mead where hunger, grass, and plenty, and withal I have no doubt, some imp of greed assailed me. All forthwith fell full cry upon the ass. A wolf of some book learning testified that that cursed beast must suffer their despite, that gall-skinned author of their piteous plight. They judged him fit for naught but gallows bait. How vile, another's grass to sequestrate. His death alone could expiate a crime so heinous, as full well he learns. The court, as you're of great or poor estate, will paint you either white or black by turns. The best fables of La Fontaine. Jean de La Fontaine, 1621 to 1695. Witty out her noticing, but as he sharpened die knife, die lit a girl's eyes. Popped open and she ran away, to die audience's delight. He repeated DIs and OTA parodies for several weeks. Soon no one could take Peale's show seriously, and attendance went way down. Within a few weeks the show closed. Over the next few years, Barnum established a reputation for audacity and consummate showmanship that lasted his whole life. Interpretation. Barnum used two different tactics to ruin Peale's reputation. The first was simple. He sowed doubts about Die Museum's stability and solvency. Doubt is a powerful weapon. Once you let it out of die bag with insidious rumors, your opponents are in a horrible dilemma. On the one hand, they can deny the rumors, even prove that you have slandered Diem. But a layer of suspicion will remain. Why are they defending themselves so desperately? Maybe die rumor has some truty to it. If on die OTA hand, you take the high road and ignore you, die doubts unrefuted will be even stronger. If done correctly, the sowing of rumors can so infuriate and unsettle your rivals that in defending themselves they will make numerous mistakes. This is die perfect weapon for those who have no reputation of their own to work from. Once Barnum did have a reputation of his own, he used die second, gender tactic. The fake hypnotism demonstration, he ridiculed his rival's reputation. Once you have a solid base of respect, ridiculing your opponent body puts him on die defensive and draws more attention to you, enhancing your own reputation. Outright slander and insult are too strong at DS.T are ugly, and may hurt you more and help you. But gentle barbs and mockery suggest that you have a strong enough sense of your own worth to enjoy a good laugh at your rival's expense. A humorous front can make you out as a harmless entertainer, while poking holes in die reputation of your rival. It is easier to cope with a bad conscience than with a bad reputation. Friedrich Nietzsche. Keys to power. The people around us, even our closest friends, will always to some extent remain mysterious and unfathomable. Their characters have secret recesses that they never reveal. The unknowableness of other people could prove disturbing if we thought about it long enough, since it would make it impossible for us really to judge OTA people. So we prefer to ignore this fact, and to judge people on their appearances, on what is most visible to our eyes, clothes, gestures, words, actions. In the social realm, appearances are die barometer of almost all of our judgments, and you must never be misled to believing OTA-wise. One false slip, one awkward or sudden change in your appearance can prove disastrous. This is the reason for the supreme importance of making and maintaining a reputation that is of your own creation. That reputation will protect you in the dangerous game of appearances, distracting the probing eyes of others from knowing what you are really like, and giving you a degree of control over how the world judges you, a powerful position to be in. Reputation has a power like magic. Weedy one stroke of its wand, it can double your strength. It can also send people scurrying away from you. Whether the exact same deeds appear brilliant or dreadful can depend entirely on the reputation of the doer. In the ancient Chinese court of the Wei Kingdom, there was a man named Maitsu Asia who had a reputation for supreme civility and graciousness. He became the ruler's favorite. It was a law in Wei that whoever rides secretly in the ruler's coach shall have his feet cut off. But when Maitsu Asia's mother fell ill, he used the royal coach to visit her, pretending that the ruler had given him permission. When the ruler found out, he said, "How dutiful is Maitsu Asia." For his mother's sake, he even forgot that he was committing a crime, making him liable to lose his feet. Another time, the two of them took a stroll in an orchard. Maitsu Asia began eating a peach that he could not finish, and he gave the ruler the other half to eat. The ruler remarked, "You love me so much, Matt, you would even forget your own saliva taste and let me eat the rest of the peach." Later, however, envious fellow courtiers, spreading word that Maitsu Asia was actually devious and arrogant, succeeded in damaging his reputation. The ruler came to see his actions in a new light. He told the courtiers angrily, "And another time he gave me a half-eaten peach for the same actions that had charmed the ruler when he was the favorite. Now had to suffer the penalties." The fate of his feet depended solely on the strength of his reputation. In the beginning, you must work to establish a reputation for one outstanding quality, whether generosity or honesty or cunning. This quality sets you apart and gets other people to talk about you. You then make your reputation known to as many people as possible subtly, though take care to build slowly and weedy a firm foundation, and watch as it spreads like wildfire. A solid reputation increases your presence and exaggerates your strengths without your having to spend much energy. It can also create an aura around you that will instill respect, even fear. In the fighting in the North African desert during World War II, the German General Erwin Rommel had a reputation for cunning and for deceptive maneuvering that struck terror into everyone who faced him. Even when his forces were depleted, and when British tanks outnumbered his by 5-1, entire cities would be evacuated at the news of his approach. As they say, your reputation inevitably precedes you, and if it inspires respect, a lot of your work is done for you before you arrive on the scene or utter a single word. Your success seems destined by your past triumphs. Much of the success of Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy rested on his reputation for ironing out differences no one wanted to be seen as so unreasonable that Kissinger could not sway him. A peace treaty seemed a fait accompli as soon as Kissinger's name became involved in the negotiations. Make your reputation simple and base it on one sterling quality. This single quality, efficiency, say, or seductiveness, becomes a kind of calling card that announces your presence and places others under a spell. A reputation for honesty will allow you to practice all manner of deception. Casanova used his reputation as a great seducer to pave the way for his future conquests. Women who had heard of his powers became immensely curious and wanted to discover for themselves what had made him so romantically successful. Perhaps you have already stained your reputation so that you are prevented from establishing a new one. In such cases, it is wise to associate with someone whose image counteracts your own, using their good name to whitewash and elevate yours. It is hard, for example, to erase a reputation for dishonesty by yourself, but a paragon of honesty can help. When P.T. Barnum wanted to clean up a reputation for promoting vulgar entertainment, he brought the singer Jenny Lind over from Europe. She had a stellar, high-class reputation, and the American tour Barnum sponsored for her greatly enhanced his own image. Similarly, the great robber barons of 19th century America were long unable to rid themselves of a reputation for cruelty and mean-spiritedness. Only when Ty began collecting art, so that the names of Morgan and Frick became permanently associated with Joseph da Vinci and Rembrandt, were they able to soften their unpleasant image. Reputation is a treasure to be carefully collected and hoarded. Especially when you are first establishing it, you must protect it strictly, anticipating all attacks on it. Once it is solid, do not let yourself get angry or defensive at the slanderous comments of your enemies. It reveals insecurity, not confidence in your reputation. Take the high road instead, and never appear desperate in your self-defense. On the other hand, an attack on another man's reputation is a potent weapon, particularly when you have less power than he does. He has much more to lose in such a battle, and your own thus far small reputation gives him a small target when he tries to return your fire. Barnum used such campaigns to great effect in his early career. But this tactic must be practiced with skill. You must not seem to engage in petty vengeance. If you do not break your enemy's reputation cleverly, you will inadvertently ruin your own. Thomas Edison, considered the inventor who harnessed electricity, believed that a workable system would have to be based on direct current DC. When the Serbian scientist Nikola Tesla appeared to have succeeded in creating a system based on alternating current AC, he determined to ruin Tesla's reputation by making the public believe the AC system was inherently unsafe, and Tesla irresponsible in promoting it. To this end, he captured all kinds of household pets and electrocuted them to death with an AC current. When this wasn't enough, in 1890 he got New York State prison authorities to organize the world's first execution by electrocution, using an AC current. But Edison's electrocution experiments had all been weedy small creatures. The charge was too weak, and the man was only half killed. In perhaps the country's crudest state-authorized execution, the procedure had to be repeated. It was an awful spectacle. Although in the long run it is Edison's name that has survived, at die time his campaign damaged his own reputation more than Tesla's. He backed off. The lesson is simple: never go too far in attacks like these, for that will draw more attention to your own vengefulness than to the person you are slandering. When your own reputation is solid, use subtler tactics such as satire and ridicule to weaken your opponent while making you out as a charming rogue. The mighty lion toys witty die mouse that crosses his path, and the OTA reaction would mar his fearsome reputation. A mine full of diamonds and rubies. You dug for it, you found it, and your wealth is now assured. Guard it with your life. Robbers and thieves will appear from all sides, will diminish the jewel's luster, and bury them from sight. Authority, therefore, I should wish our courtier to bolster up his inherent worth with skill and cunning, and ensure that whenever he has to go where he is a stranger, he is preceded by a good reputation. For the fame which appears to rest on the opinions of many fosters a certain unshakable belief in a man's worth, which is then easily strengthened in minds already thus disposed and prepared. Baldassar Castiglione, 1478-1529. Reversal. There is no possible reversal. Reputation is critical. There are no exceptions to this law. Perhaps not caring what others think of you, you gain a reputation for insolence and arrogance, but that can be a valuable image in itself. Oscar Wilde used it to great advantage. Since we must live in society and must depend on the opinions of others, there is nothing to be gained by neglecting your reputation. By not caring how you are perceived, you let others decide this for you. Be the master of your fate, and also of your reputation. 48 Laws of Power. Law 6. Court attention at all cost. Judgment. Everything is judged by its appearance. What is unseen counts for nothing. Never let yourself get lost in the crowd then, or buried in oblivion. Stand out. Be conspicuous at all cost. Make yourself a magnet of attention by appearing larger, more colorful, more mysterious than the bland and timid masses. Part 1. Surround your name with the sensational and scandalous. Draw attention to yourself by creating an unforgettable, even controversial image. Court scandal. Do anything to make yourself seem larger than life and shine more brightly than those around you. Make no distinction between kinds of attention. Notoriety of any sort will bring you power. Better to be slandered and attacked than ignored. Observance of the law. P.T. Barnum, America's premier 19th century showman, started his career as an assistant to the owner of a circus, Aaron Turner. In 1836, Dice Circus stopped in Annapolis, Maryland for a series of performances. On the morning of opening day, Barnum took a stroll through town wearing a new black suit. People started to follow him. Someone in the gathering crowd shouted out that he was the Reverend Ephraim K. Avery, infamous as a man acquitted of the charge of murder but still believed guilty by most Americans. The angry mob tore off Barnum's suit and was ready to lynch him. After desperate appeals, Barnum finally convinced them to follow him to the circus, where he could verify his identity. Once there, old Turner confirmed that this was all a practical joke. He himself had spread the rumor that Barnum was Avery. The crowd dispersed, but Barnum, who had nearly been killed, was not amused. "My dear Mr. Barnum," Turner replied, "it was all for our good. Remember, all we need to ensure success is notoriety," and indeed everyone in town was talking about the joke. And the circus was packed that night, and every night it stayed in Annapolis. Barnum had learned a lesson he would never forget. Barnum's first big venture of his own was the American Museum, a collection of curiosities, located in New York. One day a beggar approached Barnum in Dye Street. Taking him back to the museum, he gave Dye Man 5 bricks and told him to make a slow circuit of several blocks. At certain points he was to lay down a brick on the sidewalk, always keeping one brick in hand. On the return journey he was to replace each brick on the street with the one he held. Meanwhile he was to remain serious of countenance and to answer no questions. Once back at the museum he was to enter, walk around inside, then leave through the back door and make the same bricklaying circuit again. On the man's first walk through the streets, several hundred people watched his mysterious movements. By his fourth circuit, onlookers swarmed around him, debating what he was doing. Many of them were distracted by the museum's collections and stayed inside. By the end of the first day, the brickman had drawn over a T1 Ike Wasp and 11 Ike PKINCE. A wasp named Pintail was long in quest of some deed that would make him forever famous. So one day he entered the king's palace and stung the little prince, who was in bed. The prince awoke with loud cries. The king and his courtiers rushed in to see what had happened. The prince was yelling as the wasp stung him again and again. The courtiers tried to catch the wasp and each in turn was stung. The whole royal household rushed in, the news soon spread, and people flocked to the palace. The city was in an uproar, all business suspended. Said the wasp to itself before it expired from its efforts, "A name without fame is like fire without flame. There is nothing like attracting notice at any cost." Indian fable. Even when I'm railed at, I get my quota of renown. Petro Arhaino. 1492 to 1556. A work that was voluntarily presented to a prince was bound to seem in some way special. The artist himself might also try to attract the attention of the court through his behavior. In Vasari's judgment, Sodoma was well known both for his personal eccentricities and for his reputation as a good painter. Because Pope Leo X found pleasure in such strange, harebrained individuals, he made Sodoma a night, causing the artist to go completely out of his mind. Van Mander found it odd that the products of Cornell's Kettel's experiments in mouth and foot painting were bought by notable persons because of their oddity. Yet Kettel was only adding a variation to similar experiments by Titian, Ugo de Carpi, and Talma Giovanni, who, according to Bocchini, painted with their fingers because they wished to imitate the method used by the Supreme Creator. Van Mander. 1,000 people into the museum. A few days later, police ordered him to cease and desist from his walks. The crowds were blocking traffic. The bricklaying stopped, but thousands of New Yorkers had entered the museum, and many of those had become P.T. Barnum converts. Barnum would put a band of musicians on a balcony overlooking the street, beneath a huge banner proclaiming free music for the millions. What generosity, New Yorkers thought, and they flocked to hear the free concerts. But Barnum took pains to hire the worst musicians he could find, and soon after the band struck up, people would hurry to buy tickets to the museum, where they would be out of earshot of the band's noise and of the booing of the crowd. One of the first oddities Barnum toured around the country was Joyce Heth, a woman he claimed was 161 years old, and whom he advertised as a slave who had once been George Washington's nurse. After several months, the crowds began to dwindle. So Barnum sent an anonymous letter to the papers, claiming that Heth was a clever fraud. Joyce Heth, he wrote, is not a human being but an automaton, made up of whalebone, Indian rubber, and numberless springs. Those who had not bothered to see her before were immediately curious, and those who had already seen her paid to see her again, to find out whether the rumor that she was a robot was true. In 1842, Barnum purchased the carcass of what was purported to be a mermaid. This creature resembled a monkey with the body of a fish, but the head and body were perfectly joined. It was truly a wonder. After some research, Barnum discovered that creature had been every day put together in Japan, where the hoax had caused quite a stir. He nevertheless planted articles in newspapers around the country claiming the capture of a mermaid in the Fiji Islands. He also sent the papers woodcut prints of paintings showing mermaids. By the time he showed the specimen in his museum, a national debate had been sparked over the existence of these mythical creatures. A few months before Barnum's campaign, no one had cared or even known about mermaids. Now everyone was talking about them as if they were real. Crowds flocked in record numbers to see the Fiji mermaid and to hear debates on the subject. A few years later, Barnum toured Europe with General Tom Thumb, a 5-year-old dwarf from Connecticut whom Barnum claimed was an 11-year-old English boy, and whom he had trained to do many remarkable acts. During this tour, Barnum's name attracted such attention that Queen Victoria, that paragon of sobriety, requested a private audience with him and his talented dwarf at Buckingham Palace. The English press may have ridiculed Barnum, but Victoria was royally entertained by him and respected him ever after. Interpretation. Barnum understood the fundamental truth about attracting attention. Once people's eyes are on you, you have a special legitimacy. 4. Barnum. Creating interest meant creating a crowd, as he later wrote. Every crowd has a silver lining, and crowds tend to act in conjunction. If one person stops to see your beggarman laying bricks in the street, more will do the same. They will gather like dust bunnies. They will enter your museum or watch your show. To create a crowd, you have to do something different and odd. Any kind of curiosity will serve the purpose, for crowds are magnetically attracted by the unusual and inexplicable. Never let it go. If it veers toward other people, it does so at your expense. Barnum would ruthlessly suck attention from his competitors, knowing what a valuable commodity it is. At the beginning of your rise to the top, then spend all your energy on attracting attention. Most important, the quality of the attention is irrelevant. No matter how badly his shows were reviewed or how slanderously personal were the attacks on his hoaxes, Barnum would never complain. If a newspaper critic reviled him particularly badly, in fact, he made sure to invite the man to an opening and to give him the best seat in the house. He would even write anonymous attacks on his own work just to keep his name in the papers. From Barnum's vantage, attention, whether negative or positive, was the main ingredient of his success. The worst fate in the world for a man who yearns fame, glory, and of course power is to be ignored. Reports that Gossard attracted the attention of Emperor Charles V by wearing a fantastic paper costume. In doing so, he was adopting the tactics used by Dinocrates who, in order to gain access to Alexander the Great, is said to have appeared disguised as the naked Hercules when the monarch was sitting in judgment. The court artist Martin Warnke, 1993. if the courtier happens to engage in arms in some public spectacle, such as jousting, he will ensure that the horse he has is beautifully caparisoned, that he himself is suitably attired, with appropriate mottos and ingenious devices to attract the eyes of the onlookers in his direction as surely as the lodestone attracts iron. Baldassare Castiglione, 1478 to 1529. Keys to Power. Burning